Let's bring on Jared Febbroriello, JPF Securities Law, jpfsecurities.com. Jared, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Michael.
All right. Give our audience, first time on this show, but we've done shows together in the past. We have a little history here. Jared is our corporate counsel, and I wanted you to introduce yourself to our audience. You'll be back time and time again. But give us just a brief background, and let's get into some of the things that we're going to talk about today. I think you wanted to talk about ICOs and funding points for people who need to watch out for the bumps in the road. But first, introduce yourself to our people.
Sure. So I'm a securities lawyer. JPF Securities Law is a small firm. We have offices in Dallas and up in Boston. We focus on small companies, public companies, private companies, capital raises, and really anything that touches a company, including litigation. We've been fortunate enough to be hired by many companies over the years to assist them in their capital raise, and we've learned a lot along with our clients along the way. And the first thing that we really focus on is putting together a coherent plan, because capital raise is it's just like any other part of the business, but it's sort of parallel to the business that any company is currently conducting. So we tell our clients that they need to or should assemble a team and put together a plan for the amount of money that they're raising. Make sure that you know what you're using it for, and make sure that you've built in subsequent raises into your plan. And then we approach the capital markets, not really as a silver bullet, but there's sort of several different venues or avenues you can proceed on. Private placements, your traditional private placement is one of the more obvious ones. There's for your 504 or 506 exemptions. That's for our more traditional clients, companies that are trying to raise larger amounts of capital. And then you have obviously your public market, S1s, things like that, and then the newer methods such as crowdfunding and ICOs, which have come up over the last couple of years.
Let me jump in there for a second. You have written an article that we posted on our website about what Kodak did. Great writing. So let's start with the ICOs. That is the hot button for everybody right now. The do's, the don'ts, the bear traps along the way. What have you found out when working with us?
Sure. So ICOs are an interesting area, especially these days. There's sort of a battle going on behind the scenes for the different regulatory agencies to get jurisdiction over it. It looks to us like the SEC seems to be winning that war. A lot of you are probably familiar with the Howey test, which is sort of this analysis to look at an ICO and determine if it's a security or not. What we've seen is that the SEC seems to be sort of giving themselves some new wiggle room in that analysis, and the way it's starting to look is that the majority of these ICOs are going to be considered securities. So, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It just means that you have to comply with the securities laws. It's, you have to basically conduct these as you would any other private placement. Some of the other overlapping agencies would be the Treasury Department, the IRS, and then the CFTC, depending on what type of product is underlying your ICO.
Well, that brings to mind, is there going to be some retroactive issues that show up?
Well, I think there's definitely going to be some issues with taxes. We saw an article the other day saying that there's an extremely low rate of people actually paying taxes on some of these coin purchases. I think that we're going to see some issues there. The other thing that people are forgetting is that, when you do a transaction, there's a lot of benefits to having the public blockchain, but the other side of that coin is that your transaction is forever preserved in that blockchain, which gives authorities and folks the ability to go back and find it at any point in time. So, my advice would be for anybody who's trying to figure out if they need to pay taxes, go to your accountant, because you do, and you should get that taken care of as soon as possible.
Well, Jared, we had we reported not long ago that the IRS had already contacted Coinbase and asked them for a list of 25,000 of their biggest ICO or token traders, and they wanted information regarding what the transactions were like. I guess it only seems logical that would happen. You mentioned something really interesting there. We talked about the fact you do have a public blockchain that does have a record of that transaction into infinity. Why would that be an issue for most people with regard to the reporting? It seems like I would think that a lot of them want to do the right thing, right?
A lot of people want to do the right thing, but there's, it's confusing. There's a lot of different accountants out there. Not all of them are familiar with cryptocurrency. Not all of them really understand, is this a security? Is it something else? Is it a commodity? How do I deal with, first in, first out? How do I, how is this valued? Do we look at it from a long-term capital gains basis or
Right.
short term? It's just
So you're saying that the IRS hadn't really ruled on whether or not short-term or long-term capital gain and what the actual asset represents? Because it seems like it would be kind of common sense in how you would account for it.
Well, the IRS has definitely ruled on it. Again, it's more, I think, an issue of accountants not necessarily knowing how to value some of these assets, and maybe individuals maybe not reporting it well. Also, some of these transactions are done on maybe newer exchanges that don't have the same internal reporting procedures in place as your average, large broker-dealer, retail broker. So it's just it's a little bit of a confusing landscape for everybody.
All right, let's do this. Let's stop right there and take a break. We've got more to talk about when it comes to funding, talking points on ICOs with Jared Febbroriello and Ed Baxter, Michael Yorba. I'm so happy to have Giovanni Gallucci in the studio with us. All right, we'll be right back on the other side of this break with Jared Febbroriello, JPFSecurities.com. You've been listening to CEO Money with Michael Yorba and Ed Baxter. Segment is brought to you by TheVitaminPatch.com. Welcome back to CEO Money, Michael Yorba. I haven't seen your moment there. I've got Jared Febbroriello, JPF Securities, JPFSecurities.com in the studio with us. We were talking offline over the break about some really, fur and feathers things going on with these ICOs and the rulings and the IRS. Ed, you had a great question, and I wanted you to bring it back on air so the rest of the audience could hear it.
Well, obviously, Jared's a genius at this sort of thing, and he becomes the voice of reason for people who want to stay out of troubles. The two things that stand out with regard to the ICO world, or as far as I'm concerned, being a former securities person, are one, disclosure, which we'll have Jared talk to before, and also you mentioned the different groups that potentially could be regulating the ICO industry. Give us some ideas about, one, rules for disclosure, two, how the Commodity Futures Traders Commission or the CFTC would regulate something like a Bitcoin, and you indicated a second ago what it's described as, and you'll help the audience understand just how that works.
Sure. So with respect to disclosure, if your coin is not going to pass the Howey test, then it's a security. If you are selling a security, then you're subject to the securities laws. So, anything that you have to disclose for any other private placement would have to be disclosed. If you're selling to unaccredited investors, you would have to have a PPM. If you're, no matter what you're doing, you obviously can't run afoul of 10b-5. You can't have any material omissions of fact. So you would have to provide the disclosure that you would for any other offering. And it seems like a lot of companies might be missing that fact that, if you are a security, you have to comply with the securities laws. It's pretty straightforward to me.
Are they mistaking the disclosure and the PPM for the white paper?
Yeah, I think that there's some of that going on. I mean, it seems like the white paper is sort of used, in conjunction with the Howey test to say that it's not a security in some cases. We've seen some circumstances where, I think there's one case that there was pretty flagrant plagiarism of a different white paper. They didn't even bother to change half the words. So, it's one of these situations where if it's truly a unique coin and it's going to pass the Howey test, and it's not a security, then you've probably put a lot of work and a lot of time into that white paper. If it's something where it's just been thrown together and you don't know necessarily who the principles are and maybe the theories are not necessarily academically sound, then I think you're going to run into issues with your white paper, and you're probably going to end up being a security. And then at that point, you have to comply with the federal securities laws.
I guess that's really interesting, because I was chuckling when I was thinking about the fact that if somebody would plagiarize a white paper, that's interesting in itself. But it seems like, when you think about the Howey test, you said a security or not security, kind of, I guess as Michael would say, kind of dig into that one, go a little bit deeper and say what makes a security versus not being a security, and look at the Howey test for those of us who are not securities lawyers.
Sure. So the Howey test, very, very briefly, looks at whether or not it's an investment of money. It looks at whether there's an expectation of profits from the investment, whether the investment of money is in a common enterprise, and whether or not any profit comes from the efforts of the promoter or a third party. So in the case of Bitcoin, basically it's not a security in terms of, or in the eyes of the SEC, but at that point it falls back into the jurisdiction of the CFTC, who considers it a commodity. So then, Bitcoin as a commodity is taxed as a commodity, so it'll be taxed separately from all these coins that would be considered securities. So again, that I think is part of the confusion on the tax side. But just because it's not a security doesn't mean it's unregulated. You still are subject to the Treasury rules, anti-money laundering, anti-terrorism, and a whole host of other overlapping agencies.
Okay. What about the other points that you wanted to bring out on the show today? Any new changes in the capital formation sector, IPOs, Reg A pluses, things of that nature that you've been working with some of your clients that everybody should know about?
Sure. I mean, look, ICOs are I think the future. I've thought that for a while. It seems like the industry is probably going to slowly be moving that way. The technology makes a lot of sense, and I'm not saying that you can't do an ICO. You just have to do it the right way. So,
I got a question for you.
Sure.
Let's say, and let's give it a hypothetical, and I'll just throw myself under the bus on this one. Let's say I created a television show. I put up an API in front of the television player, and I said, hey, I'm doing an ICO. Click here and be my client and help us grow. Be a part of the family. Who's going to be calling me first? And what have I opened myself up for?
Well, if your ICO fails the Howey test and it's a security, then you need to be compliant with the securities laws. And it sounds like you're doing somewhat of a public offering in that situation. So you would want to make sure that your ICO fits squarely within 506C offering terms. That would mean that you would have to verify that anybody who puts money in is an accredited investor through the third-party verification process, and you would have to, file your federal your Form D and comply with SEC rules.
So you could do it. You just need to make sure they fill out a form that gets them accredited, allows them to dedicate themselves as being accredited. Then don't you also have to follow up before they can participate with you with a separate call that says verify through a third party that you are who you say you are when it comes to your financial wherewithal, your risk tolerance?
Yeah, for 506C, you have to have third-party verification. That can take the form of a letter from a lawyer or an accountant, letter from a broker-dealer, someone who has looked at your net worth and said, you are accredited, you have over $1 million net worth, and you're good to go. So as long as you have that, then you can sell direct to those people.
Got it. Okay, we got to end it there. We've got another segment up, Markets to Watch. But Jared, thanks for being a guest.
Thank you, Michael.